In a small town nestled in the mountains, there was an old abandoned train station that sat at the end of a long, winding road. The train tracks stretched out into the wilderness, disappearing into the darkness. It was said that once a month, on the night of a full moon, a ghost train would appear and make its way down the tracks, passing by the old station. The locals had always been wary of the ghost train, and many had heard the terrifying whistle and rumble of its approach. Some claimed to have seen the ghostly locomotive and its passengers as it passed by. They spoke of shadowy figures peering out from the train's windows and the mournful wails of the steam whistle. Despite the warnings, a group of curious teenagers, Amy, Beth, Ronnie, and Sheldon, decided to explore the abandoned train station on the night of the full moon. They arrived just as the moon was rising and made their way into the station. As they walked along the dusty platform, they heard the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance. Suddenly, the old station began to shake and the ground beneath their feet rumbled as the ghost train approached. The teens froze in fear as the train thundered by, its eerie green glow illuminating the darkness. As the ghost train passed by the old station, Amy, Beth, Ronnie, and Sheldon found themselves suddenly transported inside the train's final car. They looked around in confusion, wondering how they had ended up there. The interior of the train was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of smoke and decay. The floor was covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs, and the windows were boarded up, preventing any light from entering the car. As they stumbled through the darkened space, the teens began to feel a growing sense of unease. They heard strange whispers and moans coming from the shadows, and felt an icy chill creeping up their spines. Suddenly, a figure appeared before them. It was a young girl, pale and ghostly, with tears streaming down her face. She looked at them with pleading eyes, as if begging for their help. The teens realized that this was the same girl they had seen in the window of the final car as the train passed by the old station. They tried to speak to her, but she simply vanished into the shadows. As they continued through the train, the teens encountered other ghostly figures, passengers who had died on the train during its last fateful journey. They could feel the train picking up speed, hurtling through the darkness towards an unknown destination. The air grew colder and the darkness grew deeper, until the teens could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. They were lost in the void, trapped on the ghost train with no way out. As Amy, Beth, Ronnie, and Sheldon continued to wander through the ghostly train, they suddenly stumbled upon an old conductor's cabin. Inside, they found an ancient logbook, filled with faded entries and cryptic notes. As they pored over the pages, they gradually pieced together the horrifying truth about the train's past. They learned that the train had been hijacked many years ago by a psychotic criminal, who had murdered the passengers and crew and taken the train on a deadly joyride through the mountains. The criminal's name was Albert Crow, and he had been a notorious outlaw, wanted by the authorities for a string of violent crimes. He had boarded the train under an assumed name, and once the train was underway, he had revealed his true intentions. He had taken control of the locomotive and ordered the terrified passengers and crew to surrender all their valuables. When they refused, he had opened fire, killing several people and causing chaos and panic. The train had careened out of control, hurtling through the darkness at breakneck speed. The passengers had tried to fight back, but the criminal was too powerful, too ruthless. Eventually, the train had crashed, killing everyone on board. As the teens tried to escape the train, they quickly realized that they were not alone. The ghost of Albert Crow was still haunting the train, his twisted presence lurking in every shadow and corner. The teens could feel his malevolent energy growing stronger by the moment, as if he were drawing power from their fear and terror. As they stumbled through the darkened corridors, they heard the sound of his ghostly footsteps echoing through the empty train. They saw his ghostly form materialize in front of them, his eyes gleaming with an otherworldly fire. He taunted them with his twisted laughter, and they could feel his icy breath on their necks, sending shivers down their spines. The teens knew that they had to find a way to stop the ghost of Albert Crow before he could harm them further. They searched the train for any weapon or tool that they could use to defend themselves. Finally, they stumbled upon an old fuse box, which controlled the train's electrical systems. They realized that they could use this to their advantage, by short-circuiting the train's power and trapping the ghost of Albert Crow in the dark. With trembling hands, they pulled out the fuses and cut off the power to the train. The interior of the train plunged into pitch darkness, and the ghost of Albert Crow let out a furious scream. The teens waited in silence, holding their breaths, as the ghostly presence faded away. When they finally opened their eyes, they saw that they were alone once more. As the teens cautiously stepped off the train, they were relieved to be out of the clutches of the vengeful ghost of Albert Crow. But they knew that they weren't out of danger just yet. They still needed to stop the train and find a way home. They searched through the rubble and debris of the crashed train, and eventually found a piece of information that would help them stop the train. But it was located in the main locomotive, the very heart of the train, and they would have to cross through several carriages to get there. As they made their way through the darkened train, they began to feel a sense of dread creeping up on them once again. And as they drew closer to the main locomotive, they began to hear the ghostly laughter of Albert Crow once more. One by one, the teens were picked off by the ghostly killer, trapped in different carriages by his malevolent power. Ronnie was the first to be trapped by the ghost of Albert Crow. As the group made their way through the darkened train, Ronnie stopped to investigate a strange noise coming from one of the carriages. As he peered inside, he saw a figure looming in the shadows, its ghostly form pulsing with an eerie green light. Before he could react, the ghostly tendrils of Albert Crow had wrapped themselves around Ronnie's body, pulling him screaming into the darkness. The other teens heard his cries for help echoing through the train, but by the time they arrived on the scene, Ronnie was nowhere to be found. Sheldon was the next to fall prey to the vengeful ghost. As the group approached the main locomotive, Sheldon was grabbed by a pair of ghostly hands that seemed to materialize out of thin air. He struggled to break free, but the grip of the ghost was too strong. In a flash of green light, Sheldon was pulled into the shadows and vanished without a trace. The remaining teens searched frantically for him, calling out his name and shining their flashlights into every corner of the train. But he was gone, swallowed up by the malevolent power of Albert Crow. Finally, it was Beth's turn to face the wrath of the ghostly killer. As Amy and Beth approached the main locomotive, they heard a sound like scratching coming from one of the carriages. They cautiously approached the door, and Beth peered inside. To her horror, she saw the ghostly form of Albert Crow standing before her, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. She tried to back away, but it was too late. The ghostly tendrils had already wrapped themselves around her body, pulling her screaming into the darkness. As Amy looked on in terror, she could hear the muffled cries of Beth echoing through the train. But she knew that there was nothing she could do to save her friend. The power of the ghost was too strong, and Beth was lost to the darkness forever. Only Amy was left, and she knew that she had to stop the train and find a way home. She clutched the piece of information tightly in her hand, and steeled herself for the final confrontation with the ghost of Albert Crow. As she approached the main locomotive, she could hear his ghostly laughter ringing in her ears. But she pressed on, determined to do whatever it took to stop the train. Finally, she reached the control panel, and used the information she had found to bring the train to a screeching halt. As the train shuddered to a stop, the ghostly presence of Albert Crow dissipated into nothingness, and the train was silent once more. Amy stumbled out of the train, shaking with fear and exhaustion. She collapsed onto the ground, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what she had just experienced began to sink in. The police and emergency services arrived on the scene, and Amy was taken away for medical attention. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, it became clear that the horror of the ghost train had left a permanent mark on her. She was haunted by nightmares of Albert Crow and the other ghostly passengers, and she found it hard to concentrate or connect with others. She became withdrawn and anxious, refusing to talk about her experience on the train or to acknowledge what had happened. Eventually, her parents made the difficult decision to have her committed to a lunatic asylum, where she could receive the help and support she needed to heal. But even there, the memory of the ghost train stayed with her, buried deep inside her thoughts and haunting her every waking moment. She knew that she would never be the same again, and that the terror of that night would stay with her for the rest of her life. As she sat in her small room, staring blankly at the walls, she knew that she had lost a part of herself on that train. And as the years passed by, she remained trapped in her own personal nightmare, haunted by the ghostly echoes of the past and the memory of the train that rode through the mountains forever.